Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Kraft, and on behalf of the Omega Institute staff and community, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on cultivating resilience in uncertain times. We are going to be joined by Lisa Miller and Alex Korb. Lisa Miller is delayed at the moment, so we are awaiting Lisa, but we're going to start anyway with an interview with Dr. Korb. So I will interview him, and then toward the end we will have a Q&A, and just be spontaneous as Lisa arrives. So that should be interesting when it happens. So in the meantime, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alex Korb, a neuroscientist, writer, and coach. He has studied the brain for over 20 years and is the best-selling author of The Upward Spiral, using neuroscience to reverse the course of depression one small change at a time. He has completed a PhD in neuroscience at UCLA, has published over a dozen peer-reviewed journal articles on depression, neuromodulation, and other topics, and is currently an adjunct assistant professor at UCLA in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, as well as vice president of research and development for Brain Sonics. He has a popular blog on his Upward Spiral website on how the tendencies of your brain can rule, ruin, or enrich your life. And I hope he will talk with us about that. He also is an ultimate Frisbee expert, and we're very glad to welcome Alex Korb. Alex, please, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm happy to answer any ultimate Frisbee related questions
Maybe
as well.
We'll start with ultimate Frisbee. That's about really as much as anything. Alex, before we get into your current work, I'm just curious, how did you find yourself in this path to study the workings of the brain and how we ended up the way we are as human beings?
Yeah, well, in some ways it felt very spur of the moment and accidental, in that the guy across the hall from me in college was majoring in neuroscience. And so I was like, oh, sure, why not? But in other ways, it sort of seemed like, oh, of course, it was the obvious path for my life. I've always been interested in like why people do things and why people are different. And for myself, I sort of noticed like, why do I sometimes feel, really confident and happy and motivated, and other times it feels like really hard to focus, or just like, oh, you feel isolated or insecure or anxious, and it wasn't always clear when you felt which way. But part of my thinking about that and interest in that was probably because my mom was a psychiatrist, and not just a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst. But interestingly, she wasn't she never tried to psychoanalyze us, at least that I was aware of, which was nice. But actually, the fact that she was both a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist led to a lot of interesting conversations, because I remember her talking about like the problems with medication, that they're not a solution for everything. Like sometimes people just need to talk about stuff. And sometimes, however, taking a medication can help people, engage with the world more so they can actually start talking. And I think that was sort of the framework that I grew up in. And she actually, when I was in high school, joined a neuroscience study group, which I didn't click with me at the time. As a teenager, you don't really pay much attention to your parents. But she would often sort of share these little tidbits at the dinner table. I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. And actually, Dan Siegel, I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Siegel, he had the office next door to her. So he was part of her same neuroscience study group. So when I went to college and started learning about the brain, I was like, oh, this is all the stuff that my mom has been talking about, and everything that I learned in that first neuroscience class I took. I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. Like why people, are the way that they are, and how we perceive and misperceive things. And so when my friend from college said, "Hey, I'm majoring in neuroscience." I was like, "Oh, that sounds fascinating. I can't think of something better to do with my time."
That's amazing, and it's just you were basically born into it as well, so it's fascinating.
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about you've observed changes to the brain during interventions and during life changes. So that's a little bit more like drilling down into why we are the way we are.
Yeah.
What kind of physical changes have you observed when people are going through changes?
Yeah. The um that was really what fascinated me most about neuroscience. I mean, on the one hand, there's the like studying why people are different or why the way they are. But what I thought was so interesting is that by making changes in your life, whether it's just a simple thing like going to sleep at the same time every night, or a bigger, more transformational change, or like going, to psychotherapy or something, the actions that you take and the thoughts that you have and the interactions that you have change the activity and chemistry of key brain circuits in measurable ways. Um, and in grad school, we were trying to study depression. And I say trying to study because it's very complex. And in science, there's a lot of trial and error. But one of the things we're interested in is like, how does someone's brain change over the course of their depression? Or can you predict before someone even starts treatment, like by measuring their brain, is someone going to get better or not? And there's a lot of different ways to study this, either through electrical recordings from the brain or using fMRI, which looks at subtle blood flow changes. You essentially make a movie of the brain. You can measure different neurotransmitter levels with other technologies. And there's a lot of key circuits involved, primarily the thinking circuitry in the brain, which is often called the prefrontal cortex, the emotional circuitry in the brain, also known as the limbic system, and there's the habit and reward circuitry, which are part of the striatum. And in things like depression or anxiety, it seems something is a little bit off by the way these brain regions are communicating with and regulating each other. But by making these small life changes, by changing your sleep patterns, by changing your interactions, by getting some exercise or getting some sunlight or going through therapy, you can actually change how reactive these brain regions are in certain situations. You can actually change how they communicate with and regulate each other. And in grad school, I was primarily studying one particular type of intervention, which was antidepressant medications. And unfortunately, a lot of times when people think about changing the brain, whether they're people who want to change their own brain or psychiatrists who are trying to help people get things back on track, almost everyone's mind goes immediately to, oh, you want to change brain chemistry? You take antidepressant medication to target some neurotransmitter system. Or you might think, oh, I'm going to do some high-tech intervention like, use magnets, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, for those of you familiar with it. And those are powerful ways to change brain circuits. But the more research that I got exposed to in my lab and elsewhere, I started to realize that there are so many ways to change the brain that don't just involve high-tech interventions developed in a lab. As I mentioned, things like exercise has measurable effects on key brain circuits, or changing your sleep patterns, or even something as simple as practicing gratitude or deep breathing can change the emotional circuits in the brain and the way that they're regulated by the thinking circuits.
Relating to this moment, you talked about stress and pleasure neurotransmitters in your work. So what is the role of those in our moods, and how do we deal with them as they naturally arise and come and go during our daily lives?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you said naturally arise, because oftentimes people, when they hear the word stress, they have these automatic negative associations with it. They think of, the stress of like preparing for a presentation, or, the stress of a job interview or something. And it's true. There are, like, the colloquial way we use the term stress is like that feeling of, pressure or strain. It's almost synonymous with anxiety. But scientifically, stress in your brain and your body is just the fact that like something changes in the environment that your body needs to respond to. Because life is only possible in this like really narrow band of concentrations of different chemicals and temperatures and everything. You might be able to think back to like ninth grade biology, the term homeostasis, where your body has to be in a very narrow temperature range, and you have to have a certain concentration of salt and blood sugar and oxygen. And your body is really amazing at getting that balance. But anytime something changes in the environment, and it could be big or small, it could be, oh, it suddenly got a little bit warmer out. Well, you have to, cool your body down or you'll slowly die. Or your blood sugar drops. Well, at some point, you probably got to go eat something or you'll slowly die. So stress is an essential component of keeping you alive. And on top of that, stress can also has these positive aspects of improving your performance. If you are doing a job interview or taking a test or giving a presentation or playing ultimate frisbee, if you have too little stress, well, you're probably going to be unfocused and make stupid mistakes, and that might cause problems if the thing you're doing is important. Now, if you have too much stress, it also gets in the way because you're overthinking things and you're questioning yourself and you're having all this self-doubt, and increased stress response actually gets in the way of proper functioning of the thinking circuits, the prefrontal cortex. And so ideally, we want to try and find this appropriate balance. And that's hard to do when people are automatically assuming, oh, stress is always bad, I always need to get rid of it. Instead, we should realize like, oh, and that stress is often good for us and is often essential. And thinking of it, just that small tweak in thinking of it can actually better help manage stress. Because oftentimes something stresses us out, and then that stress triggers our emotional circuitry in the brain. It triggers our habit circuitry in the brain. And if you have a habit of, say, always focusing on the negative or self-criticism, then you'll automatically trigger these thought patterns of like, oh my God, why am I stressed? This is bad. This stress is going to ruin everything. It's going to get in the way. And then your stress goes up. It's going to increase those thoughts. It's going to start getting into the way. It's going to start creating this reinforcing pattern, something that we're probably familiar with, of a downward spiral. Like when you start to get stuck, then you further get stuck because of all of these automatic thoughts and emotions floating through your head. But by acknowledging, oh, I'm feeling really stressed right now, that actually activates the prefrontal cortex in a way that automatically reduces the limbic system's emotional reactivity. And so it doesn't pull, your old habits don't pull you quite as hard. And then it's easier to make an intentional next step instead of just being, yanked wherever your habits are taking you. So that's a little bit of a flavor, just sometimes by changing that belief about stress and acknowledging that you're stressed is oftentimes the most powerful first step.
So that moment of self-acknowledgement is a moment of awareness. So that kind of leads us to the practice of meditation, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a lot of people are talking about how mindfulness creates a deeper sense of self-regulation, which is what we're talking about. But often in the midst of stress, we don't remember or we don't have the time to meditate. So how do we do that? So
yeah.
And I also see, we're so grateful that Dr. Lisa Miller is joining us too. So, Lisa, you're muted right now. Thank you. Thank you for going through all your journey to get here, and really appreciate it. We started, I introduced and have been interviewing Alex, and I don't know that this would be a good time to do a formal introduction to you, Lisa. So I'll just acknowledge that you are doing amazing work, and your book, The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life, is making a real impact. And you both are based in a neuroscience model, evidence-based research showing how we can work with brain and neuroscience and neurotransmitters to change our lives. So, Lisa, welcome. Do you want to say something to our audience?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here. As we know, impasses make the arrival that much sweeter. So it is a joy to be able to connect. And yes, I'm joining you, sharing alongside many who come to Omega, a real meeting of paradigms. I think Omega has led the way in moving us into a 21st century understanding of who we are and how we can come to know who we are. I think very commonly in the 20th century, people would say, I am a very scientific person and I only believe what science shows. Therefore, the spirituality stuff, it's not proven to me, not through science. I don't believe it. And then other folks would say, I'm a profoundly spiritual person. I know in my deep inner wisdom, in my heart, that the spiritual life is real. I don't care that science can't look at it. But now, crossing this bridge, we see that science and spirituality can very readily go hand in hand. That science is a lens, and whether we're talking about a microscope or a telescope or an MRI study, we can point the lens at a broad host of questions, including the impact of spiritual life in the human journey. And it's that body of science, it's science, if you will, as witness, that just as we can stand up one by one and give testimony, we can look at the chorus of human experience as witness. And science is a form of witness. I would say it's a very sacred pursuit as such. And we're there. We can very readily, scientists have now asked the questions. We've shifted the focus of the lens and realized that really the limitations in the past were the limitations within the scientists, not within the method itself. It's a perfectly good method. And the scientists have expanded to embrace a broader view of understanding and use what tools we do have to see how in that journey, the footprint in the sand can be tracked by science.
So that kind of seems to segue right to what we were talking about when you joined us, the role of meditation in working with, how can I put it, working with reducing stress, creating greater self-awareness, even more agency and wisdom in our lives. Alex was speaking about how there are clear indications in brain science and neuroscience that meditation has an impact, and I think you both have something to say about that. Alex, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciated Lisa's perspective on that because science is just a tool, and there are many ways to use that tool. You can use that tool to look at, how does this medication improve someone's mood? But you can also look at things like, how does meditation improve someone's mood, or how does the experience of awe, for example, like going to the Grand Canyon and reconnecting with nature and experiencing these awe-inspiring vistas, like how does that actually change not just your mood and your perceptions, but like what is going on in the brain when that happens. And I think sometimes people often put, science and spirituality on different ends of a spectrum. Like, well, you're either being analytical or you're being emotional. But science is just an objective way of understanding these emotional experiences. The thing about emotions is like, well, and a lot of times spirituality, it's about your subjective experience. That's not wrong. It's just that we can't necessarily measure that in some way or extrapolate across people. And measuring something scientifically and objectively doesn't make your experience wrong, and your experience doesn't invalidate the science. They're just two different ways of looking at the same thing. It's oftentimes they can inform and support each other and give us insights that we wouldn't have recognized any other way. For example, when I was first studying depression, I was like, there's got to be something that we could like measure about the brain that would tell us, like, is someone depressed or not? And this is, a lot of people have been looking at this for a long time. And I finally realized, like, oh, no, there isn't. And there might be someday, but the quickest way to determine whether someone is depressed or not is to ask them. Like, it's not as clear objectively, like, oh, what you should measure and look at. But it's pretty clear, like, well, if you ask them how's your mood, how's your sleeping, that is not wrong. Their experience is true and is often a more sensitive measure of what is going on than our core scientific tools. But ideally, we can use those hand in hand. But to get back to your
I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
The hand in hand, I think, is beautiful. And I think that's right. At the table of human knowing, if you think about our inner table of human knowing, we have the empiricist and the logician, and we have the intuitive and the mystic and the skeptic, and everyone's there. And when we engage multiple forms of knowing, then we have far more creativity. We have far more available to us. We're more situationally aware. We're more creative. This is our birthright. And I think there's a little catching up that our educational system has now underway, which is certainly, I'm very appreciative. I had very well-intentioned, very well schooled and trained teachers, but I learned a lot about building, if you will, the bicep. I learned a lot about empiricism and a lot about logic, and I love it and use it. But equally, as a scientist, as a human being, I rely on intuition and honoring mystical moments and engaging the skeptic, getting all the knowers together. 70% of scientists say their very best work was actually inspired through a synchronicity, a dream, a mystical moment. That the question which guided their entire inquiry was brought to the table of human knowing through a mystic and intuitive, someone other than the empiricist and the logician, who were essential to bearing out the method and stating what could and could not be found empirically. So we need everybody. And in fact, when we put people in the MRI who engage multiple forms of knowing, who are, if you will, in a sense of quest, ask a question of the head and receive, inspired, an answer of the heart, they have paved the highways between regions of the brain. There are myelinated tracks using DTI that show a more integrated brain, which is oftentimes a sign of a good brain. So this is our birthright, and we can adjust. We can do a course correction in our mainstream culture by speaking openly about intuition and mystical awareness. We can do a course correction in our schools by allowing children to know in multiple ways, and then supporting their observing eye and knowing through which path did you come to know this.
I just wanted to note that an integrated brain would be an integrated life. And I think you both, Alex and Lisa, are speaking to that. I'm curious,
Yes.
At a time when we've just come out of this pandemic, if we're out of it, but apparently we are, so many of us were isolated and we lost the sense of connection with one another. And so that's part of our experience too. And I'm curious how you integrate work with stress and depression and anxiety and our spiritual cultivation through meditation or self-awareness. How do we integrate that with a sense of community? I mean, how can we become more resilient? And that seems like it's all tied together. So maybe we can just address that, because I'm seeing people's questions and they are asking about community and resilience.
The human brain evolved in a very different time than we're living now. And pretty much anytime you're feeling like stuck or like wondering, why do I keep doing this way, or why are people like this? I think it's always helpful to think back to the time when the brain evolved, because it makes a lot more sense then. So, the human brain evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago, but you think back to, I don't know, 30,000, 50,000 years ago, humans were living in tribes of 100 people or so. And we evolved that way because we need each other. Like, compare us to other animals. Like, we don't have sharp, horns or big teeth or particularly thick skin. Like, I always sort of joke, like, think of a cow. Like, a cow is wrapped in leather. Humans are very fragile creatures, but we have these big brains and these nice opposable thumbs. But those are only sort of really useful to allow us to work together to accomplish things and protect each other. And our babies are so fragile for so long. Like, a horse, it's going to start walking right away. Like, we need a community to actually be able to survive as a species. And that became hardwired sort of in our brain, both to experience enjoyment and pleasure from those deeper social connections and sense of trust, but also to experience fear and pain when we didn't experience that connection, when perhaps experience social rejection. And that is why if you text your friends or your crush or whatever, and like you see those 3 dots on the phone, and then they erase, and then the 3 dots again, and you're like, oh my God, what are they saying? And then they don't respond, and like it creates a sense of anxiety. Or just when your friends do something fun without you, you have this fear of missing out. And that's exactly sort of comparable to the situation that if a human 50,000 years ago, you were walking through the forest collecting berries with your tribe, and all of a sudden you looked up and there was nobody there. Like, hey guys, where are you? And like that sense of like, oh, like the worst thing in the world is to be abandoned by your tribe, because it's essentially the same thing as being attacked by a lion, and you're not going to be able to survive on your own. And so our brain evolved to treat social rejection in the same way as like being attacked, or in fact physical pain. The pain of social rejection activates the same anterior cingulate cortex as experiencing physical pain. And that is why, like, I've had to remind myself through this whole pandemic, it's like, oh, why does everything feel so difficult? And to remember, like, yeah, because it's difficult, because we didn't evolve to live isolated lives. And sure, Zoom is great, but very slight delay in sound and difference in eye contact kind of makes you feel that like no one's really paying attention to you. Like, just imagine in a real life scenario where you talk to someone and then they just pause. Oh, and then they talk. Oh, like, were they not paying attention to me? Or like, if you were trying to look in them in the eye and they're just sort of like looking around, like, these are very subtle little cues that help us feel connected with people that are just much more difficult to get the same thing over an internet connection.
That's very much to the point, and we are still ancient beings. We are still tribal beings, even though we live in a very modern built environment. And there's a essential need for connection. that when we miss it, it's terrible, and we spend our lives trying to restore it. Lisa, can you say something about that? And because
yes, we are
it's a spiritual
absolutely
thing as
heard
well
that.
as an emotional thing.
Beautifully put, yes. And in fact, we see that across faith traditions and across time, moving into a state of transcendent awareness is sometimes done in isolation, and it is very often done as well in community, in groups. So Jews have the minyan, fellowship. There's a sense that by being together, I had this experience very profoundly, both in the synagogue where I grew up and in the Inipi when I was a guest of the Lakota, that in praying together, we're both praying for ourselves, for one another, but there is yet a superordinate, a oneness to the prayer that goes up together. And in fact, when I was in the Inipi, in my mind's eye, I could see that. I share it in the Awakened Brain. But I want to share a scientific finding. I also share this in the Awakened Brain, that when 9 people are in a state of deep transcendent connection, whether through meditation or prayer, and the 10th person walks in to join, they more quickly, that 10th person, move into a state of transcendent awareness as measured by the rapidity with which their mirror neurons come up online. So we are herd bound socially, and we are meant to be in collective spiritually as well as individually. This is how we're designed. And in fact, in our studies, we've looked at how people of all faith traditions, so Jewish, Hindu, Catholic, Christian, or spiritual and not religious, all have the same circuit run during a transcendent moment, in particular one in transcendent relationship. And the very same circuit runs whether I'm Catholic, Hindu, Jewish, spiritual, but not religious. And what's remarkable is that spiritual brain, that hardwired gift, which we can choose to use, grows thick and strong as measured by cortical thickness over time. And that very same seat of awareness through which we talk to our higher power, through which we feel a oneness with all life, through which we have a sense of transcendent relationship, is the very same seat of awareness through which we see God or spirit in one another. Relational spirituality, whether I look at you and see an emanation of life, of creation, or I feel that presence in direct relationship to source, that is the same seat of awareness. Love of neighbor is a sacred form of this transcendent awareness. So this is really quite a testimony to how we're built. We're not just spiritual beings. We are spiritual beings built to see the ultimate presence, essence in and through one another.
There's a question I'm going to read out loud from the chat. Nora Kiger asks, could you define transcendent relationship?
Yes, thank you. I'm so glad you asked. And it actually gets to a larger point I'd like to highlight, which is scientists do not define spirituality, but we're very good at identifying threads of lived spirituality in the human life, dimensions of lived human spirituality, identifying them and seeing from whence they come and what else might be said across the broader spectrum of our lives, if that is present. So I will give you an example. The transcendent relationship, I think, is of all the dimensions of spiritual life, that which carries the most robust protective factors against suffering. I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. Nature is a sacred home. I see myself at one with all life. The sense of being in a felt, dynamic relationship with the transcendent presence, whether in the first person, oneness, the second person, I talk to God and feel and know an answer, or the third person, as in our rich indigenous tradition, spirit in and through crow and sun and water and mountain. The deeper seat of transcendent awareness was identified in about 97 by Ken Kemmler through a twin study as having a heritable component. We are all endowed with the capacity for a transcendent relationship, 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed, which means that muscle can be built or atrophy. And later, what we did together, the Spirituality Mind Body Institute, my institute at Columbia, in collaboration with our colleagues at Yale Medical School, was we took what we knew from epidemiology to be an heritable capacity, that transcendent awareness of relationship, and put that into an in-scanner task in the MRI. And we invited 18 through 25-year-olds to tell us a time where you felt a deep connection, a relationship with your higher power, the universe, nature, the spirit in into your nature. The first finding was that nobody was confused. Everyone had had this experience. The second finding was whether they were religious and spiritual or spiritual and not religious, whether they were Catholic, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, the same neurocorrelates ran, and they were three loops, the bonding network. Just as we're held as children in our parents' or grandparents' arms, we perceive, we feel that life itself, God, spirit, holds us. We shift our attention from top down dorsal to bottom up ventral, which means instead of I've got to have it, I want this out of life, mail order on Google, there's a sense that life is showing or guiding. We're loved and held, we are guided, and we are never alone. The parietal that puts in and out hard boundaries lets us know that, yes, I'm locked in my COVID apartment, but at the very same time, I'm a point, I'm a wave, I'm part of still the fabric of life, the oneness, the family of life. We are loved, held, guided, and never alone is the phenomenology, the experience, the awareness of the three circuits of what I'm calling the awakened brain. But what it is in terms of the history of science over the past 20 years, at least, is our capacity to perceive a transcendent relationship independent of what tradition we're from, spiritual but not religious. It's ours if we choose to engage our awakened brain.
Alex, do you want to comment and respond to that? That's a lot to think about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's often this natural sort of dichotomy as we think about our opposition between thinking about God and spirituality on the one hand and science on the other, because there are certain elements of God and religion that are not scientific, like whether there actually is a God. Well, there's not scientific evidence for that. But independent of that, we can still measure the power of your faith in God. And ironically, I say it's ironic because a lot of times people who are religious emphasize the power of faith, and yet they're also trying to prove that God is real. Science can't prove that the supernatural. Science can only sort of look at the natural. But the point where they sort of agree is well, in some ways it's kind of irrelevant whether it's whether there's some guy up there pulling the strings or not. Your faith in things, your belief in things, does have measurable effects on your brain activity and chemistry. And one of the other interesting things that she sort of mentioned about, we are not alone, is that there's lots of things that are true out there, but that does not mean we are always focusing on them. And one of the interesting things about loneliness is that many of us often feel lonely and disconnected. And the reason why that's ironic is because, if you were just, instead of thinking about your own loneliness and disconnection, thinking about there's so many other people out there who feel the exact same way as me. This is just sort of a fundamental part of the human condition sometimes. Then you wouldn't feel quite so alone, because I was actually just talking about this I teach a class at UCLA, and I was just talking about this on Monday, that loneliness and being alone are independent things. They do influence each other, but they're both separate things, and they're both independent risk factors for things like depression. Because you could be alone, i.e. by yourself in your apartment, and still feel very connected to other people. Conversely, you could be at a party and be surrounded by other people and feel totally isolated and disconnected. That doesn't,
right.
The only problem comes really when when we feel a certain way and we tell ourselves I shouldn't feel that way. Regardless of how you should or shouldn't feel, this is how you feel. but thinking about it differently, like, oh, you do feel alone. Yeah, you should feel alone. You're isolated in your, apartment. But thinking like just changing what you're focusing on, like, oh, everybody else is feeling the same way. Oh, that can change your feelings. You don't need to use rationality to deny your experience of your feelings. It is just thinking, critically and analytically, sometimes changes your perspective on your feelings or your relationship to your feelings. And so the analytical parts of your brain and the emotional parts of your brain do not have to do battle with each other. And that often is what in each of us, we find ourselves stuck. Like, oh, should I just like be happy and like go with the flow? Or should I like understand this and think about it? And the ideal way sort of to achieve sustainable well-being is to find an appropriate balance between those two. So you're not overwhelmed by your emotion and get caught on a downward spiral. But nor are you sucking the fun out of everything by, analyzing it to death. That you can find, that you can create an upward spiral by using understanding and analytics as a tool for what that's good for, and using feelings and emotion as a tool for what that's good for, and finding the balanced communication between them.
So these are
Alex. Alex is a good teacher. I bet his students at UCLA love him. He's a beautiful teacher.
Oh, thank you. I think they like me. That's what I've read on the reviews. Although I do read out the negative reviews sometimes at the start of class, because people are like, this class has way too much neuroscience. And other people would be like, this is so simplistic. I'm majoring in neuroscience and he doesn't even, I'm like, okay, well, it's both of those things. It is an introductory neuroscience class. And it's funny how different people can have totally different experiences of the exact same thing, and neither one of them can be wrong.
I do find that students are quest. So the class might be called neuroscience, or my class is called psychology and spirituality, but they're there because they're on their journey. And, I think that that's one of the gifts of this realm of science, is that ultimately it speaks to the human experience. It speaks to our journey. I think your point about separateness and oneness is so profound and important. The way I phrase it to my students is, we are a point and we are a wave, and we have to keep that in balance. So yes, we are magnificently, exquisitely diverse, magnificently diverse. And in fact, you could say spirit is the superposition of all people and all things and beyond. So we are magnificently full of spirit and diverse. And we are part of one field, one wave. We are white caps on one ocean. We are part of one family of life, one oneness of being. And we need to hold both. I mean, that technically, yes, that's the parietal putting in and out hard boundaries. And we do find where there's a thick cortex in the parietal, and look 1 year later, people are less depressed using their parietal. But I do think that there's a lot of talk about difference and not a lot of talk about oneness. And right now, our society is pretty splintered because we only see the difference. And difference alone is nothing but a power grab. It's lonely. But when we are both different and one, there's one human heart, then I want to know you. I want to hear your journey. If we're only one, then we can ignore the differences led to unfairness and asymmetries and discrimination. But when we're one heart that can hear each other's stories, then we can really draw in love into each other's lives. Then we can have a unitive field of love, as well as an articulation of different journeys. I think we can hold both. I think we're ready to hold both. And I think the next step for us is to honor each person's path and feel it and know it and share our own stories with love, the connective tissue, so that we don't just sort of fly in all different directions. We need a common ground.
That is well said, and it's even in this conversation, it's interesting to see the different points of view that between the analytical, science-backed analytical, and the science-backed, I'll say, expansive. They're both valid positions, and the view of God is,
yes,
as Alex said, it doesn't really matter whether we can prove this or not, because it's still part of our human experience, and so it can be measured and responded to and worked with. And I'll just note that so many people have talked about the feeling of isolation changing when they have an experience of spirituality or oneness or God, because when you have that, you're not alone anymore. And so there's something very profound in that. And I wonder, Lisa, people have been asking about your work with schools. You work with something, the Guilford Center, for example. What about the role of spirituality in education?
Such an important point. We have the Collaborative for Spirituality in Education, and we also run the Awakened School Institute and recently hosted Awakened Campus. And effectively, when we look at the roadmap of science, we can see that through childhood, the child is born with this innate capacity for spiritual awareness. And science has charted that. We can say that a child perceives, unless socialized otherwise, a child sees continuity of consciousness or spirit after death. A child perceives the capacity to know without necessarily being told, unless socialized out of it. Other labs have charted that. The child's a knower. And if we look, of course, at twin studies, there's a heritable endowment. Of course, the child's a knower. Every parent knows our children are not blank slates. And yet this natural spiritual core needs to be nourished. And we wouldn't dream of knowing that we're physical beings that need physical fitness for the physical core. We wouldn't imagine a school without PE, physical education, or a school lunch for nutrition to feed the body. Well, this natural spiritual core from which emanates social and moral direction, from which emanates relational ethics and connection and sisterhood, brotherhood, this natural spiritual core needs to be nourished. And it can be done so in a way that is inclusive and constitutional. It is a natural human endowment. What we did was we went around the country for 3 years and we looked at spiritually supportive schools. Some were public, some were private, of many different faith traditions, secular, well-endowed, thin resources, all different types of schools. And what we found was that no matter whether we were looking at a Black Panther school in West Philly that nourished the community, or a very well-established Catholic school or yeshiva, or a public school, wherever we looked, there were core, deep relational dimensions to that school. There was a climate, a culture based on literally the air and water felt different the moment you walked into the lobby of that school. And it was an intentional design that all these schools had in common. And we nailed them down. The gift of sharing the experience of these schools allowed us to distill the DNA of a spiritually supportive school, which actually could be readily transposed to the DNA of any spiritually supportive organization. I'll give you a couple examples. There is a language of transcendence. It's real. We have something to call it. There is a practice shared by everyone, from the receptionist at the front door to the head of school to the third grader to the eighth grader. A practice of transcendence that is both quieting and receptive, the catch and the catcher's mitt, so that we are both capable of opening our inner space and receiving inspiration, transcendent awareness through it. There is a person, a third dimension to spiritually supportive schools, whose full-time job it is to speak the spiritual values of the school. So if a student's about to be thrown out, this person stands up. He or she is entitled and encouraged to speak before the head of school or anyone else and say, can we pause and think of our more foundational spiritual values in understanding this student? And on. These schools all had, we had 12 that every school had, or they maybe had 8 of 12. What we realized is that these could be taught, and any school can become a spiritually supportive school. And we offer this now free through our Awakened School Institute at Columbia Teachers College, our Spirituality Mind Body Institute. And 180 schools have done it. Yeah. 180 schools have showed up. Yeah.
Lisa. That is extraordinary work. And I'm curious, so we're getting questions. I want to have this go to both of you if possible. We're talking about science, we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about the science of moderating or understanding our moods and stress. Are these different according to different cultural norms? Are we speaking this from a purely white experience? Does race come into it? This is a question from the chat box. How relative are all these, or is there some sort of a standard that we can use neuroscience to help us with?
Well,
go ahead.
I think, yeah, I mean, one of the, it's interesting when Lisa was talking earlier about how, we should think about how we're all, the same in our oneness, like that is true and is important. But I find often that part of the problem with science is that science is often investigated how are humans all the same, and that's where we're trying to find universal things that are true across all people, and there are a lot of things that are true across all people. But one of the challenges in a lot of scientific studies is that they've been largely conducted on a much non-representative sample of the human population. And there's a great, now I'm blanking on the author's name, but do I have it sitting right here? No, he wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World. And the point is that a lot of our scientific studies have been conducted on people who are Western educated, living in industrialized, rich, democratic countries, and then trying to extrapolate from that to all of human experience. But in fact, the types of people that we study really only represent, 8 or 10% of the human population. And there's so much variety across cultures, and culture is one of the first things that starts to impact the development of the brain. It tells us how we should experience different emotions and which emotions we should experience and how we should communicate with each other and how we should relate to each other. And, in the US and in Europe, we place a lot more emphasis on, individual rights, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in other cultures where there's more of an emphasis placed on interdependence, and community harmony and connection, then their values can be different, and the way our brain responds in different situations can be different. There's a super cool study where, if you ask people from the US, whether certain characteristics apply to them and whether they, certain adjectives apply to them or to their mother or to some other third party, different parts of the brain light up. And when you're thinking about yourself, you activate the self-focused parts of the prefrontal cortex. And in Chinese participants, when they thought about themselves or were thinking about their mother, the same self-focused parts of the brain were activated. And so their brain did not make as strong a distinction between themselves and this close person. Whereas in Western cultures, we're often taught no, you're an individual, your feelings matter, and one is not better than the other. They just lead sometimes to different challenges, and they have different advantages. But it's important to recognize that there isn't sort of yes, there are some universals into how the brain works. But we are all shaped by our culture and experience, and it's important to recognize that.
Thank you. And Lisa?
I would say, in answer to your question, yes and yes. It's a both and. So again, we are a point and we are a wave. We are magnificently unique and diverse, and we're cut of one existence. So let me give you some examples. In our lab, we've done a great number of cross-cultural studies where we seek at once to understand a rich range of cultural expression and some common universal core. We try to look at both simultaneously. I'll give an example from our lab and also an example from a fellow lab. So in our lab, 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed is our deep seat of transcendent relationship. That means that we all have this, and yet it is 2/3 environmentally embraced. It has a rich variety across cultures, across traditions, across families. Well, when we looked at the profound protective benefits of transcendent awareness against depression, we found that in the United States, the preponderance of that expression was in a relationship to God or in a relationship to a unitive reality through meditation. But it was told in that sense of connecting with the higher power. When we looked using the same study in Asia, we found that the mediation of the transcendent relationship against depression was indeed there. And it was expressed in a relationship with ancestors. So in both cases, there was a sense of relational spirituality as being protective against depression, but its expression differed in the US. We looked at 11 countries around the world.
I apologize to everyone for the bandwidth issues, and we are very, very happy that these two people came together. Alex and Lisa have a lot to offer, and we're very grateful. And I think we'll have this posted, probably cleaned up and posted within a day or so. And thanks to everyone for all your questions and for joining us.